about Turkey in World War II? Should we start?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Can you see the screen?
Yes, I sure can.
The years between 1939 and 1945 corresponded with the Second World War, an extremely destructive period in which the countries of the world were subject to disintegration into the Allied and the Axis powers. Turkey had experienced the trauma of the First World War and had taken on the burden of the Ottoman Empire, which had already collapsed and had fought the War of Independence after invasion of by international forces. The Republic of Turkey was tired, lacked adequate military and economic resources, and had resolved not to take part in war unless its territorial integrity came under a threat that was realized in the Second World War. Turkish politics were based on the decision to survive by maintaining the nation's territorial integrity. At the core of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's foreign policy lay the principle of peace at home, peace in the world. The cadres that founded the Republic of Turkey aimed to protect the territorial integrity of the Republic of Turkey and the Republican regime by establishing good relations with great powers and other nearby countries. Turkey had survived the desired division between 1919 and 1923 and had remained prudent after the 1930s in its dealings with the countries like Germany and Italy that had requested the revision. After Adolf Hitler entered the office in Germany, Albert Einstein wrote a letter to Atatürk in 1933 and asked him to allow 40 Jewish professors and doctors to emigrate to Turkey. Atatürk accepted the request and invited all the scientists, as well as Einstein himself, to come and live in Turkey. This is Einstein's letters to Atatürk. World War II started in 1939, a year after Mustafa Kemal Atatürk passed away, when modern Turkey was only 16 years old. The country was still economically and socially healing after World War I and wasn't strong enough to enter a war. Prior to the outbreak of war, Turkey signed a mutual aid pact with France and Britain in 1939. After the German invasion of France, however, Turkey remained neutral because the government thought that the military action could bring conflict with the USSR. Although Turkey developed economic, military, and diplomatic relationships with Britain and France, acted very carefully to avoid harming relations with Germany. For example, Turkish decision makers defined Germany as a friendly country at every opportunity and never abstained from expressing this view in public. Turkey had strong economic and cultural reasons to avoid a hostile relationship with Germany. Turkey was an important producer of chromite, which is a key ingredient in the manufacture of stainless steel and refractory brick. Germany had limited access to it. The key issue in Turkey's negotiations with both sides was the sale of chromite to Germany or the Allies. The Allies had access to other sources and mainly bought the chromite in order to preclude its sale to Germany. Turkey halted its sales to Germany in April 1944 and broke off relations in August and declared war on the Axis powers in February 1945 after the Allies made its invitation to the unusual meeting of the United Nations, along with the invitations of several other nations, conditional on full belligerency. No Turkish troops ever saw combat. Good governance and vigilant diplomacy kept Turkey safe. İsmet İnönü was the head state of Turkish Republic at the time of the war. He was a veteran general of the World War I and Turkish Independence War. He knew firsthand exactly what war was and the devastation it would bring to Turkey. He was the mastermind of the diplomatic maneuvers Turkey undertook during World War II, appeasing both the Axis and the Allies and trading with the Germans at the same time and supplying them with war material and thus eliminating one reason for an invasion. Vienna Conference. This was a meeting between Turkish President İsmet İnönü and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill on 30 and 31st January of 1943, where Churchill tried to persuade İnönü to join the Allied forces and fight the Axis powers during World War II. During the meeting, İnönü showed extreme reluctance to join the war. Germany-Turkey relations during the war. During World War II, Turkey maintained diplomatic relations with Germany until August 1944. The German-Turkish non-aggression pact was signed on 18th of June 1941. In October 1941, the Claudius Agreement was achieved, whereby Turkey would export up 45,000 tons of chromite ore to Germany in 1941 and 1942, and 90,000 tons of the mineral in each of 1943 and 1944, contingents of Germany's supplies of military equipment to Turkey. In an attempt to prevent the supply of this strategic mineral to Germany, the United States and the United Kingdom went on a spree of what was termed preclusive buying out Turkish chromite even if they did not need so much of it. As a part of the package deal, the Anglo-Americans bought Turkish dried fruit and tobacco as well. In August 1944, the Soviet army entered Bulgaria and cut overland contact between Turkey and the Axis powers. Turkey severed its diplomatic and commercial relations with Germany and on February 23rd, 1945 declared war on Germany. Turkey's economy. After the establishment of the Republic of Turkey until Atatürk's death, Turkish economy was built strong by a special staff. Debt from Ottoman Empire has been paid, but after that 1929 crisis came, and that forced Turkey to demonstrate a mixed economy. Before the Second World War, Turkey's financial status was income 250 million Turkish liras, expenses 248,300,000 Turkish liras. Foreign trades were as good as state finance. In 1939, it seems that governmental funds, which is reserved for defending, significantly rise. In 1934, about 30% of the income was reserved for defense. In war years, Turkey's half of the income has gone to defending budgets. In 1941, the defending budget was 302 Turkish million liras. During World War II, there was a stagnation in the country in the terms of economy. The reasons of recession, recruitments of the majority of the population, workforce and employment were decreased, the budget was reserved for defending, foreign trade countries were in the war, rapid increase in inflation. Turkey Economic Congress, 27th November 1948. The trade unions and chambers were organized after the Izmir Congress of Economics. This congress was solved the fundamental problem of the non-development of the economy as the state's intervention. The government's support was on private enterprises was increased.
Hello. Conclusions of the Congress. The state should only make regulated decisions. The state should do its primary duty. Creation of an institution that analyzes the economic situation of the country. Tax rates should not be compulsory. Energy problem must be solved with increased production quantity and quality. Precautions that Turkey took during World War II. Turkey took civil defense measures for the danger of German occupation. Interruptions in the radio broadcast were made, military spending increased, ship cruises stopped in Black Sea, going out after 11 p.m. was forbidden in some areas. Getting on traffic was forbidden to personal vehicles. Later, it included commercial vehicles. Blackout administration started in all cities for aerial attacks. National Precaution Law, 18 January 1940. The National Protection Law was enacted in order to protect the national production that entered into force in January of 1940 and to remove the obstacles in production, increasing working hours, organizing the production, consumption and distribution relations, appropriating the managements that would hamper the production, organizing the foreign trades, taking the materials that what are necessary for the country defense. These kinds of authorizations were given to government. Property tax law enforcement, 11 November 1942. Property tax was an extraordinary wealth tax. It was taken from firstly Armenians that who deal with trade and industry, then farmers, artisans, and paid employees. Bread card application, 14 January 1942. This is the card that what was given to families to buy bread in big cities to prevent the emergency of famine during World War II in Turkey. Bread card applied for some of basic consumption products such as olive, sugar, and bread. It's an example for bread card. Perspective of society. Turkish government made some preparations in case of joining the war. They declared mobilization to protect Turkey's impartiality. It made production less, so that inflation got higher. Although it was war, some of the money of government had spent for education. Turkish government started to build new primary schools. On the other hand, by the legislation which in 1940, they have built village institutes to educate the villagers. At the time of warriors, people wanted to know political events and decisions about war. So the radio of Ankara started the regular broadcasting so that some of the great singers in that time have found chance to show themselves to society. Some of them are Munir Nurettin, Safiye Ayla, Müzeyyen Sener, Hamiyet Yüceses. To give an education of music in 1940, conservatory has opened in Istanbul University. Also, some of the great poets from society showed themselves to all country by different type of poem, which was called Garip Akımı. The most famous ones of them are Orhan Veli Kanık, Said Faik Abasyanık, Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar, Peyami Safa. Turkey suffered hardships and shortages of the war, but was spared the devastation. This is much to credit of the head of state of the time. İsmet İnönü, who knew firsthand what exactly war means for his country, he understood war. He understood the power of a strong army as a deterrent. Even if Turkish army was nowhere as modern as the Germans and would not stand a chance in the fight, he mobilized the entire country, enlisted every young man capable of holding a gun. He made sure both allies and the Axis understood that invading his country would not be a cakewalk and would be hardly worth the effort. Thanks for listening.
Do you have any questions?
Yes. What did you learn from this project? What did you learn about the Turkish neutrality that you may not have already known?
We learned that the strong political maneuvers protected Turkey.
Okay. And how do you think this has helped or hurt your country during the Cold War? Or after World War II, how did all the preparations during World War II, how did that help during the years following?
I think Turkish government is a new of state, so that we need to increase ourselves and develop some of our units, like economy, like some of the societies. So if we enter the open war, it's always harm for us. so that I think I found it so successful.
Do you have any, did you talk to any family members or anybody that may have first or secondhand knowledge of the living during those times, and how did they feel?
Can you repeat?
Yes. Did you talk to maybe your grandparents, great-grandparents, or anybody like that? How did they feel living during those times?
Well, I don't know anyone who lived in that era, but if my friends know, they can tell me stuff about it.
My mother grandparents told her that they were so poor, so they traded all what they have to other villages. So
Wow.
it was, hard time.
Wow. Do you know how it impacted Bursa particularly? Do you have much trouble there during World War II?
Bursa.
Your city?
I think there is not, because it's a global effect.
Right. Okay. Okay. Now, we have no further questions on this side. Lance will have a couple of presentations here for you guys, and we realize that you may have to leave. When you leave, just go ahead and leave, and then we'll record it and we'll send it to you too. But that was really good. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
So I just share the screen.
Okay, share screen. And it's on Google Drive. Right here. Right that one.
This one.
Hmm?
There we go. It just has to load up. Hello, as you already heard from my teacher, I'm Lance Belderall with the Next Generation Researchers. And today I will be presenting December 7th, 1941. Was Pearl Harbor a surprise attack? So what did FDR know and when did he know it? We must go to the root cause of the political stance of this matter. So on December 7th, 1941, this is what changed America forever, the Pearl Harbor attacks. So December 7th, 1941 Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was one of the most defining moments in American history. But why is it one of the most defining moments? So the attack of Pearl Harbor was essentially these three things. America was unprepared and considerably weakened. The attack caused the US to formally enter World War II, and the memory of a sneak attack fueled a US determination to fight. But was it really a sneak attack in the first place? So now I'd like to go into my four main points, of which the first one being that this was a carefully planned attack by the Japanese. So this carefully planned and well-executed attack removed the US Navy's battleship force as a possible threat to the Japanese Empire's southward expansion. So the McClellan memo essentially made the course of action for suggesting this type of things. A, that make an arrangement with Britain for the use of British bases in the Pacific, particularly Singapore. B, make an arrangement with Holland for the use of base facilities and the acquisition of supplies in the Dutch East Indies. C, give all possible aid to the Chinese government of Chiang Kai-shek. And D, send a division of long-range heavy cruisers to the Orient, Philippines, or Singapore. E, send 2 divisions of submarines to the Orient. F, keep the main strength of the US fleet now in the Pacific in the vicinity of the Hawaiian Islands. G, insist that the Dutch refuse to grant Japanese demands for undue economic concessions, particularly oil. H, completely embargo all US trade with Japan in collaboration with a similar embargo imposed by the British Empire. And finally, I, if by these could be, let's commit as an act of war, so much the better. So essentially, this was the memo that set up the US for these kinds of negotiations. For on July 25th, 1941, the United States froze all Japanese assets in the United States, ending all trade and denying Japan the oil upon which the nation and empire depended on. So on November, the US intercepted 2 new offers from Tokyo. Plan A, for an end to the China War and occupation of Indochina. And if that were rejected, Plan B, a modus vivendi, where neither side would make any new move. When presented with these, 2 were rejected out of hand at the November 25, 1941 meeting of FDR's War Council, Secretary of War Henry Stimson's notes speak of this prevailing consensus. The question was how we should maneuver them, the Japanese, into firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. Essentially, this is where the narrative, where the US government actually tries to get the Japanese to attack first. And this US peace plan with Japan on November 26, 1941, further corroborates or actually makes the statements true of how the US wanted to make Japan attack first. Because why would they have peace plans with a country they weren't involved in the first place? These were merely just more requests on that matter. So the US had a goal in this whole instance. They were trying to dictate terms to a country not even fought yet. If Japan had surrendered under these circumstances, they would have lost face at home and around the world. The US was asking the impossible to provoke Japan into starting a war. Even Secretary of War Stimson said without too much damage to ourselves, bringing that central theme of how the US should want to go about this. And Secretary of Navy Frank Knox said that we can wipe the Japanese off the map in 3 months, meaning that they were confident that if they did go into battle, they would have been the victors of this whole thing. So the US ambassador to Japan comments that Japan, a harakiri nation, proved more likely to fling herself into national suicide for honor than to allow herself to be humiliated. This is where that narrative actually starts making sense. If they were to go into a battle or into a war with each other, then the US would use all these means to do so. And after all of this, how could American political leadership be surprised by an attack at Pearl Harbor? Just look at the headlines of the Hilo Hawaii newspaper after this meeting. So now we go on to the second point. This wasn't a sneak attack at all. So did FDR allow the Japanese to attack on December 7th, 1941? Well, there are 3 theories I'd like to propose to you. One, that Roosevelt and Churchill, of which they both knew about the assault in advance and told Roosevelt, but they both agreed to sit on the information, obviously having some sort of arrangement. Number 2, Churchill did not tell us, the Roosevelt president. He knew of the attack, but he didn't tell him at all. And finally, the third theory, which was presented in actual article in Life magazine, not only was Roosevelt aware of the attack, but actively had a hand in orchestrating it. He was known to have been sympathetic to the Allies, but could not intervene because it would have gone against public sentiment to engage in a European war. So now FDR knew, and there's actually a video on this on YouTube of where this person explains how the article in the Life magazine pans out. It actually says that FDR knows certain information about this, even intercepting some messages. So how did he know in the first place? So the betrayal at Pearl Harbor was written by James Rusbridger and Eric Nave in 1991. Nave had in fact broken the Japanese naval cipher in 1939, and Rusbridger was a former M16 intelligence officer. So the backgrounds of these 2 co-authors gave the book much publicity and credence. The central claim of betrayal at Pearl Harbor was that Britain had broken the Japanese codes and knew of the attack in advance. So now we have one country knowing of the attack before they even do anything about it. On November 25th, 1941, Japan's Admiral Yamamoto, he sent a radio message to the group of Japanese warships that would attack Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Newly released naval records prove that from November 17th to 25th, the United States Navy intercepted 83 messages that Yamamoto sent to his carriers. Part of the November 25th message read, "The task force keeping its movement strictly secret and maintaining close guard against submarines and aircraft shall advance into Hawaiian waters and upon the very opening of hostilities shall attack the main force of the United States fleet in Hawaii and deal a mortal blow." Essentially being that they had all this really strict information before they even had the attack happen. So we knew in 1945 that FDR had known about the attack in December 7th, 1941. So as you can see from these newspapers that actually corroborate those statements. And the proof is even in his own words in his messages to the commands, as you can see here. Now, I'd like to bring up an interesting quote Franklin D. Roosevelt said himself, in which in politics, nothing happens by accident. If it happens, you can bet it was planned that way. So this is the notion that he was going on when he was actually going into the intercepted messages and how to go about the plans for making Japan attack first. As we can see, we can't see this as an accidental or out of surprise attack anymore when he himself said that this was planned this way. So FDR even wrote in his speech these kinds of sentiments on these 3 pages. So now I'd like to go on to the third point, the attack itself. The US naval fleet in the Pacific was anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. So these are pictures of the gruesome attack at Pearl Harbor. Now, the attack at Pearl Harbor was on Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941. While most American sailors were still asleep in their bunks, Japanese aircraft carriers flew over Pearl Harbor. So planes and submarines of the Imperial Japanese Navy began a surprise attack in the US under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi. So Japanese planes from aircraft carriers flew over Pearl Harbor, bombing every ship in sight, as you can see from the photos here. So this attack lasted less than 2 hours. 2,403 Americans were killed, including over 1,100 in battleship Arizona sank. 68 civilians were killed, and almost 1,200 were wounded, and approximately 150 planes were destroyed, along with 20 warships that were sunk. So what does this essentially mean? Well, it means that they knew of this attack and they deliberately had those attacks happen in order to go into war. They needed something gruesome, needed something impacting. So they went about this by saying it was a surprise attack, as you can see from the photos here. Now, this was a surprise to US citizens, of course. American people were stunned by the attack on Pearl Harbor. However, high government officials knew that an attack somewhere in the Pacific was imminent because they had broken the Japanese code. So the partial surprise was that government officials did not know the exact target and date for the attack. Many believed the attack would be in the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, or Malaya, where the attack might have not been a surprise if vital intelligence information was passed to the naval commander, Admiral Kimmel. So the promises to not recognize Israel is where Franklin D. Roosevelt actually works with King Ibn Saud, was interested in a plan for a Jewish state, which essentially being that he was not going to recognize that state anytime soon. So this actually has disputes with Japan because by 1940, US relations with Japan were becoming increasingly strained. And the reason for this was because of Japan's invasion of China and territorial ambitions to extend its conquest to Southeast Asia. That's where you see the previous deal with the Israel state being incorporated into that. Now we go into the fourth point, politics. The whole root problem of this issue was that this was for politics in the first place, to show that America had a part in the war and to show that they could win this major war. Now, FDR gears up for this kind of thing by doing the Selective Service Act of 1940, where this was actually the first peacetime draft in the US, and all men aged 21 to 35 required to register, later changed to 18 to 65, and required men picked up for duty to serve for 12 months. Now, there was a famous hero against FDR at home, as you can see from these videos here, Charles Lindbergh, and also the address to neutrality. Because FDR had said that he would keep out of war, or rather that was the common opinion about it. They wouldn't want to get involved in the war, so they wanted neutrality. So he had to do this against the public's opinion. But how do we go about changing the public's opinion entirely? Well, the only way to get the US behind the war is to get Japan to attack. That was the only way they could actually have the public opinion accepting of this involvement in the World War in the first place. So did you know that in 1994, the McCulloch Memo was declassified? On October 7, 1940, Lieutenant Commander Arthur McCulloch submitted an 8-step plan to provoke Japan into attacking the US. So now we actually have these exact memos from the people involved corroborating the statement that they are the ones who provoked Japan and knew of the attack. So to get the Japanese to attack, FDR gave in 1937 the quarantine speech, in which the quarantine speech on 1937, it called for an international quarantine of the aggressor nations as an alternative to the political climate of an American neutrality and isolationism that was prevalent at the time. The speech intensified America's isolationist mood, causing protests by isolationists and foes to intervention. Essentially, the speech was a response to aggressive actions by Italy and Japan, suggested the use of the economic pressure, a forceful response, but less direct than just outright aggression to Japan and Italy. So on FDR October 1937, the speech sets the tone for the economic sanctions to come. On where Roosevelt's quarantine speech had these multiple things. Hopes for global peace are undermined by aggressor states. Foundations of civilization are threatened. The US and the Western Hemisphere are also in danger, and the complete isolation from the world is impossible. US must reestablish international law and morality. War is like a disease, it must be quarantined to protect the world. And with the speech, FDR sounds the alarm that America must now take notice of global problems. So he's the one who instigated this very message from the very beginning. And this is further corroborated with Japanese response, which being the USS Panay bombing on December 1937. So after the sinking, Japan agrees to pay $2,000 for damage, in which they killed 3 American sailors and they had 45 people injured. At around 10 o'clock on the morning of December 13, 1937, New York Times correspondent Halit Abin received an unexpected visitor, Rear Admiral Tadao Honda, on the Imperial Japanese Navy. A band was in Shanghai covering the Sino-Japanese War that had been raging since the previous July. And while unexpected, this visit was not entirely out of the ordinary. America was in the international settlement, a foreign enclave of the city that was ruled by a largely Anglo-American municipal council, not subject to Chinese law. So now we go into the disputes with Japan on how they wanted to provoke them. Beginning in 1940, Japan was allied with Germany and Italy as one of the Axis powers. So Hitler's success in Europe provided an opportunity for Japanese expansion into the Southeast Asia, where territories held as colonies by the European nation. And European nations were too preoccupied with stopping Hitler's expansion in Europe to deal with Japan in the first place. So when Japan joined the Axis on September 1940, FDR responded by prohibiting the export of steel and scrap iron to all countries except Britain and nations of the Western Hemisphere. So his action was aimed at Japan, which protested that it was an unfriendly act to do. In July 1941, Japanese troops occupied French Indochina, in which from there, FDR cut off Japanese access to vital materials, including U.S. oil, which was the trade embargo mentioned earlier. So on negotiations, both sides, the U.S. and Japan, realized that Japan needed oil to fuel its navy and its air force. If the U.S. embargo on oil did not end, Japan would be forced to extend its conquest by taking oil resources in the Dutch East Indies. So the Secretary of State Holt insisted that Japan pull its troops out of China, which Japan refused to do. And this was an obvious violation of the open door policy instilled. Sorry. Japanese ambassador to the U.S. tried to negotiate a change in U.S. policy regarding oil, in which the agreement seemed unlikely in the first place. So in October, a new Japanese government headed by General Hideki Tojo made a final attempt at negotiating an agreement, which neither side changed its position in the first place. So FDR's military advisors hoped that an armed confrontation with Japan could be delayed until U.S. armed forces in the Pacific were sufficiently strong. So Japan believed that quick action was necessary due to its limited oil supplies, and Japan was trying to become the dominant power in East Asia and the Pacific. That's why they wanted to attack America in the first place. They had invaded China in 1933 and were preparing to conquer Indochina, Malaysia, and the Pacific Islands. They needed all this necessary to attack America because they just wanted to be recognized as a world power. Since the U.S. had been growing steadily more opposed to the Japanese expansion, they knew if they attacked the other countries that U.S. might go to war to stop them in the first place. So they wanted to control these territories because they could use our oil and raw materials that was needed for their own industries, essentially doing all of these things, attacking us, attacking those territories just to gain resources from us in order to stop them. So Japan decided to attack us first, and they hoped to hurt us so that they could obtain more territory while we were indisposed. And once they had it, they hoped to make peace with America, keeping said territory. However, not all were happy in Japan. For example, here, this is a Japanese admiral in which he even quotes, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," meaning that Japan did not do all this for its own goals, in which they just made the situation worse for themselves. Now, here are some suspicious facts I'd like to bring up of the attack in the Pearl Harbor. One, that virtually all warships were hit at Pearl Harbor. They were obsolete and left over from World War I and lined up and tied together. Two, all of our carriers and most of our newer warships were not at the Pearl. They were at the sea. Was this a coincidence? Well, we don't believe in coincidences because of FDR's quote, "Everything was planned that way." Now, three, there is no doubt that the U.S. knew an attack was coming and that Pearl would be hit. Four, most U.S. citizens and most of Congress were isolationists and/or pacifists. And finally, five, only a few days prior to the attack, the Army was ordered to cluster up and line up their aircraft fighters and bombers instead of dispersing them. And finally, six, radar warnings were ignored by the higher-ups on the morning of December 7th. That's how you know they were trying to cover something up, and that's how you know they wanted to provoke Japan in the first place, as you can see from these photos here. And FDR knew and manipulated the USA and Japan into war. Now, here's how the conspiracy theory is. Many people believe that FDR and the government allowed the Pearl Harbor attack to occur to gain the public support for World War II. This theory states that U.S. government sacrificed Pearl Harbor and that Pearl Harbor was simply a single piece in an intricate game of chess. Now, FDR manipulates the Japan to attack by saying this quote here. So he actually changes in spite of that, where in fact Leahy, who was the chairman of the Navy's Medical Consulting Board, who would ultimately agree with the diagnosis of Dr. Howard Bruin. Essentially what this being was that he was very sick and he needed something to do in his last term if he were going to be replaced or dying in his last fourth term. Essentially being, this was the major thing that he needed to do. He needed to get Japan to attack in order to have the World War instigated of the public opinion in the first place. Essentially meaning, since he was sick, he needed the public's opinion to do this last big thing. So we are the next generation researchers. Is this a conspiracy? You decide. We presented you with the facts and now you decide the truth. In today's society, you are told what to think, but we are prompting you to stop and acknowledge this evidence. Think of how we are being deprived of our precious freedom. Remember December 7th, 1941, where Americans lost their lives because of the lies of our government. Now, on that note, I'd like to bring another presentation. I'd like to bring the April 12, 1945, where we were told that FDR died, but was he murdered? It just needs to load up a second. So now, was FDR murdered? We have to link the future to the past, and there are multiple links to look at in the first place. Now, I'd like to present two quotes, two very contrasting quotes here. The greatest enemy of truth is often not the lie deliberately contrived and dishonest, but the myth persistent, persuasive, and unrealistic, in which this was a quote by JFK given on June 11th. And now a quote by FDR on May 1941, "You know, I am a juggler and I never let my right hand know what my left hand does. I'm perfectly willing to mislead and tell untruths." Two very contrasting and stark opinions, but both having similar situations of their deaths. So to seek out the truth here, let us not begin with April 12, 1945, but February 1945 at the Yalta Conference. So this happened on that day, in which that day, FDR looks very bad and very sick. So Karl Marx is going to win this war, said Father McCullen. But how did, after fighting a world war, did almost 1 billion people become communists almost overnight? As you can see at the Yalta Conference, he was very sick. So he gives away territory to Stalin. At the Yalta Conference, he gave Stalin's enslavement of 725 million people a moral legitimacy, in which he lay in Stalin's lap the existence of little nations and the lives of the little peoples he had sworn to defend. FDR didn't demur at a single request or suggestion from Stalin, suggesting that he was very friendly with him. Just for signing the agreement, he was given Sakhalin land and the Kuril Islands of Manchuria, in which Outer Mongolia, parts of China, and 3,000 tanks, 75,000 motor vehicles, and 5,000 planes for his Far East army, who were incapable of taking China without U.S. aid. Stalin demanded and got 20 million Germans for slave labor for an indefinite period. As Hopkins said, the Russians have given us so much at this conference that I don't think we should let them down. FDR told Stalin that he would make Britain give up Hong Kong. So essentially what we have here is their agreement and their very secret masters to Patrick Hurley, in which called FDR a secret agreement, a blueprint for the communist conquest of China. So now we see the relationship between Stalin and FDR. But was FDR sick at Yalta, or did he get sick during the conference? So at the beginning of his campaign of FDR in 1932, you can see that he's very healthy. You can see that he's a healthy young man, and you can see that he's not sick at all. But at the end, at 1944 and 1945 came around, he was in very bad shape, a very stark contrast to what he was when he began his office. So was he murdered? Well, the headlines hint this, and there was a sudden death in that issue in which the health problems were hid from the public, and it was easy to kill a dying man. Now, on that last note, why was it easy to kill a dying man? Well, Frank Leahy memos July 1944 said that FDR would die in office. So this corroborates the statement that he was very sick in that matter. The memo essentially says all of these things, in which they took his x-rays and took his health, and he even worked with his physicians, FDR, to try and keep this under wraps from the public in the first place. He even went on to explain that the president had likely been on the verge of a heart failure in recent months as a result of high blood pressure. So the perfect person to murder is a dying man. This is what we go into the narrative of how they wanted to kill FDR while he was very sick. One of the best ways to murder a person is to do it in public and to do it to a dying man. But why is that? FDR was dying, but he could have lived months or even years more. Several things were happening in a matter of months that FDR was not wanting, and would have if he had lived tried to stop those things from happening. So they needed to get rid of FDR in order to fit their plans. So FDR was a master at not giving away his health problems. As you can see here, it was kept tightly under wraps even with his family and to the public, in which he worked with as much as people as he could to keep the hidden truth that he was actually very sick. But he could have lived more than when he was killed in the first place. And that's where I'd like to bring the first point. The war was ending and FDR wanted cooperation with USSR. They didn't want a Cold War. So these three things of which FDR says, one, the unity and cooperation of the United States, the United of Soviet Socialist Republics, and the United Kingdom, the big three, as the content for the United Nations, in which the essence of Roosevelt's views on the US-USSR-UK relationship was included in the Yalta Declaration. Two, the dismantling of the colonial empires, which were to be supplanted by sovereign states. And finally, three, economic development as exemplified by the proposal FDR made at the Yalta Conference to develop the entire Danube River basin according to methods of the highly successful Tennessee Valley Authority. So Stalin knew about the cooperation and the infighting within the FDR administration, as you can see from the direct quotes here of Elliot Roosevelt and Stalin. So Stalin knew all the infighting was happening with the FDR administration, and he also knew that if and when Roosevelt left office, things would change between the USA and the USSR. So he already knew that something was going to happen to FDR, or had a feeling that something was going to happen and that office would change so drastically. Now you should keep that in mind. You should keep all of Roosevelt's policies in mind for when Truman gets bumped up to president. So Stalin's thoughts on 1945 and FDR's death. This is a direct quote, in which upon being informed the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt, wrote an anonymous pamphleteer in 1947, where Joseph Stalin immediately contacted in person the man who was the ambassador to the United States, Andrei Gromyko. He instructed Gromyko to go personally to the White House and insist that the casket be opened, and report to him definitely whether or not he was convinced that Franklin D. Roosevelt was dead. Gromyko obeyed orders as far as possible, but was soon brought to a shocking halt. He discovered that even an ambassador from one of the four most powerful nations on earth would not be permitted to view the remains. So something peculiar going on here, something very strange. Why would he not be allowed to look at the casket unless they were trying to hide something? So Stalin distrusted the people around FDR in the first place, as from the situation with Gromyko and as for the situation with Eleanor Roosevelt too. As you can see from the maps here and the distinctions. And now we go into the point two, where FDR did not want to use the bomb in the first place. So this is the Hyde Park Aid memoir, in which the short agreement between President Franklin Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, dubbed the Hyde Park Aid memoir, was an attempt to ensure nuclear weapons would remain only in the US and Great Britain's possession, which was written in 1944, and the agreement also reveals the plans of the two leaders to use the bomb against Japan, as well as Churchill's immense distrust of Niels Bohr. So, murdered, but who would check a dying man in the first place? Truman is briefed on the Manhattan Project April 25, 1945, or 2 weeks after becoming president, but why was that? Maybe he wasn't shared the information during his vice presidency. So President Harry Truman learns the full details on the Manhattan Project, in which scientists are attempting to create the first atomic bomb on this day in 1945. The information thrust upon Truman a momentous decision of whether or not to use the world's first weapon of mass destruction. Now, as you can see, if he does use it, then that is very 180 changing of attitudes of how FDR wanted to drop the bomb or didn't want to drop the bomb. As you can see, he didn't want to drop it in the first place because FDR didn't even inform his fourth-term Vice President Truman that it existed. As you can see from the top secret tube alloys here and how they developed the bomb in the first place. But when FDR was alive, in 1940, Roosevelt gave a speech on the Pan-American Scientific Congress where he discussed some of the moral concerns scientists had about wartime. Speaking about the ongoing war in Europe, he said, "What has come about has been caused solely by those who would use and are using the progress that you have made along lines of people in an entirely different cause." So President Roosevelt approves the production of the atomic bomb. We know this now. but he never wanted to drop the bomb on Japan or drop it in any instance, because we were beginning to work on the atomic bomb even before entering World War II. So even though FDR approved the making of such a secret project, the atomic bomb, there is no evidence that he would approve the use of such bomb in an actual war. It is interesting to note that ever since the first and second use of atomic weapons in war, there was never have been another use of such weapons. President Truman is the only president and only leader country to ever approve the use of such, and they have used them not once but twice. So after FDR's death, military considerations changed. So as you can see, they wanted to drop and use the atomic bomb because of favorability to the Allied cause. As you can see from the descriptions here below, Germany had surrendered in May and troops in Europe would soon be available for redeployment in the Pacific. Manila had fallen in February too, and Iwo Jima was in resources of the Indies. So though defeated in a military sense, Japan showed no disposition to surrender unconditionally. This is where FDR's death is important. The military wants to do otherwise. We're dropping the bomb on Japan if they did not give up, and they showed no clear signs of giving up in the first place. So this was the official order to drop the bomb, in which these four things happened. So Stimson, Secretary of War, and Barnes, Secretary of State, advised Truman to use the bomb spring and summer of 1945, where Truman approves the decision. And 2, the decision was non-interference. And 3, Lieutenant General Carl Spaatz requested a written order. And 4, that is when the official order was actually dropped on July 25th. Now here's some pictures on the atomic bomb that we had. And here are the results of how devastating it could have been, as you can see from the Japanese destruction of the photos below. And this was actually Hiroshima after the bomb. So this was Ground Zero Memorial on Nagasaki 2014. It was a deep impact to Japan, and it was a deep reason for why they gave up on that war. And President Truman actually comments on the atomic bomb, saying how dreadful and how devastating it was, but how fruitful it was to end the war. So the third point I'd like to bring up is that against the establishing Israel, FDR was king of Arabia. So why is this important? Why are these relations important? Well, again, we have to look at the background before FDR and the political background after FDR. So let's look into that. USS Quincy in the Suez Canal, February 14, 1945. On his way home from the Yalta Conference in declining health, Franklin Roosevelt stopped in Saudi Arabia to meet with King Abdulaziz ibn Saud. So Roosevelt's intention was to persuade the Saudi king to support Jewish immigration to Palestine. So FDR changes his mind on this when the king Abdulaziz was slaughtered a goat on deck for their meal, then proceeded to convince Roosevelt to abandon his plans of supporting the Jewish homeland in the first place. So FDR did it for oil. Saudi King Abdulaziz then persuaded the allying Roosevelt to make a secret oil for security agreement where the United States would supply military assistance in training and build a military base in Arabia in exchange for secure access to Saudi oil. So this was the letter that was given out on April 5th, 1945, in which the Saudi king followed up with Roosevelt in a letter. He wrote back on April 5th, 1945, promising that the United States would not recognize a Jewish state. 1 week later, Roosevelt was dead, and that was severely changed. So the next president, Harry S. Truman, immediately proceeded with plans to recognize the state of Israel. This is where we see peculiar things going on. He's doing the direct contradictions. He dropped the bomb when FDR didn't want to, and he recognized the state of Israel when FDR did not want to. But why was this? Was he being controlled? Was he merely a patsy? So the letter from President Roosevelt to King ibn Saud, April 5th, 1945, essentially corroborates their good relationships on how he didn't want to recognize it based on his gratification to his good friend. So FDR plot sounds like a plot that will be used almost 20 years later. From the very beginning, you can see how JFK was kind of correlated to this kind of death. However, little was written about a possible successful Zionist plot to assassinate FDR. In 1945, it was actually Josephson who made it a life work to attack Roosevelt, and he wrote a book called The Strange Death of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Essentially, Josephson contends that FDR was assassinated in Warm Springs, Georgia. However, Josephson craftily suggests that Winston Churchill had been poisoned by Joseph Stalin's agents. This is where you can see the situation happening of how he was kind of poisoned at the Yalta Conference and how that was leading to his death and his sickness. A cerebral hemorrhage was also the official cause of Roosevelt's death in Warm Springs on April 12th. And according to Josephson, the FDR's personal physician, Admiral Moss McIntyre, said FDR's body was not involved but in less than 4 hours after his death, FDR's body had turned black. This is a clear reaction to arsenic poisoning, and there were also reports that there was a disfiguring bullet wound to FDR's head and powder burns. The small silver pistol was found near his body. So earlier, I said that this certain person, a certain representative of the four greatest nations, was not allowed to see the body. Well, now that's clear because Gromyko was not allowed to see it because there was a clear poisoning, and they wanted to hide that from the public. They wanted to hide spread of information of that happening, but they knew that they already had some kind of agreement that FDR had a sudden death and was probably poisoned at the Yalta Conference, seeing as they didn't allow him to see the body. So on the occasion of the 67th anniversary of Israel, Rabbi Benjamin Black wrote that we can now see divine fingerprints in the replacement of FDR with Harry S. Truman, a man who previously enjoyed a friendly business relationship with a Jew and found himself in the unique position of being able to make possible the creation of the state of Israel, which his predecessor pledged to never allow. Now look at that last sentence, which his predecessor pledged to never allow. Was this a reason to murder FDR in order to get the United States, in order to get Truman to recognize Israel as a state? So Roosevelt promised no recognition of the state of Israel, as you can see from the introductions here, and how he met with King Abdulaziz. This essentially just further corroborates the statement of his plans before being killed. So when Truman became president, things were severely different. As you can see at a Chicago rally in 1944, Senator Truman said, "Today, not tomorrow, we must do that all is humanly possible to provide a haven for all those who can be grasped from the hands of Nazi butchers. Free lands must be open to them." Truman wrote in his memoirs, "The question of Palestine as a Jewish homeland goes back to the solemn promise that had been made to them, the Jews, by the British in the Balfour Declaration of 1917. So essentially what we can take with this is that Truman was inexperienced in foreign affairs and initially felt that he was out of his league and crushed by the burden of his new office and responsibilities. Nonetheless, he didn't forget the peculiar situation about recognizing the Palestine state in the first place. But why was that? So inexperienced, but he was thrusted onto this job because they needed someone to fill in the job. They needed someone to fill in his shoes. And they needed someone to recognize all these things, recognize Israel, and also drop the bomb in the first place. And that's where I'd like to go into the fourth point. Furthering his political goals before he was killed, FDR wanted to dismantle colonial empires. Now, the reason this was important is because there will not be another world war based on his goals. Roosevelt formed a military alliance with Great Britain to win the war against Hitler's Third Reich, but he had plans to create a different world after the war to prevent another world war, a world without colonialism. He was acutely aware of the danger that unless colonialism were finally eradicated, a world war was virtually inevitable. This just further corroborates the statements and the background before and after FDR's death. So at the Casablanca conference in January of 1943, Roosevelt was even more on that notion on that empires should not be. I'm talking about another war, and I'm talking about what will happen to our world. Essentially comments that are saying that if they don't get rid of this kind of colonialism, then Roosevelt is sure to think that another world war is virtually evident. So he understood the danger that the British imperial policies posed to the world, and he was acutely aware with having to deal with this threat in the first place in a forceful manner. At the conclusion of the war in 1942, Roosevelt quipped prophetically to one of his advisors, "We will have more trouble with Great Britain after the war than we're having with them during." So Roosevelt's guiding principles are essentially these 6 things. On January 1945, Roosevelt stood before Congress and spoke of a moment unprecedented in the history of the Union, in which he spelled out his economic Bill of Rights. Equality of opportunity for youth and for others, jobs for those who can work, security for those who need it, the ending of special privilege for the few, the preservation of civil liberties for all, and the enjoyment of the fruits of scientific progress in a wider and constantly rising standard of living. So these are the 4 freedoms that he spelled out when he articulated and embodied in the Atlantic Charter. So in the future days, which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded upon the 4 essential human freedoms. The first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second is freedom of every person to worship God in his own way everywhere in the world. The third is freedom from what? which translated into world terms mean economic understanding which will secure every nation a healthy peacetime of life for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. And finally, the fourth one is freedom from fear, which translated into world terms means a worldwide reduction of armaments to such a point in such a thorough fashion that no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor anywhere in the world. So FDR was astute on having no colonies in the first place. He had this kind of attitude before he was killed. So obviously you can see these comments further corroborating that kind of behavior. And that was suddenly changed afterwards, after he was killed. Ellie even questioned not returning the colonies, in which Roosevelt even replied, how do they belong to France? And why does Morocco, inhabited by Moroccans, belong to France? Further instigating his stance on no colonies. So after April 12, 1945, we actually forgot that we were anti-British in the first place. In the strictest sense, our enemy today is the same one the United States have been fighting for over 200 years, the British Empire. It is of major consequence that we had an American president in the personality of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who formulated a grand strategy to defeat America's mortal enemy. How is it that what we call is essentially World War II generation today acts in ignorance of this historical fact? Millions of men in uniform who served their country on the battlefield abroad, and millions of men and women who fought the war on home front here in the United States knew the British were our enemy. It was part of our culture that period. It was natural for Americans to have an animus towards the British. So the belief that colonialism was wrong and the country should be free to govern themselves has always been a matter of principle for the majority of Americans, and the one that sets us absolutely apart from the British. So now I'd like to go into my fifth point. Why did some want Truman to be president in the first place? Because Democrats knew two things when the 1944 election year began. Franklin Roosevelt would be the nominee for an unprecedented fourth time if he wanted it. And Roosevelt, if elected, would die in office. Those facts and the approaching climax of World War II made the selection of FDR's running mate exceptionally important in this matter. They weren't just picking a vice president, no. The Democrats knew that Roosevelt would die if he was elected. They were choosing a president in waiting, and that's where you should realize that the vice president, Henry Wallace, could not be that man. They needed someone else, someone who would have done what they said, and someone who would have cooperated with their actions. So, Wallace, a mercurial Iowan, had joined the ticket 4 years earlier and had proceeded to befuddle just about everyone. He was liberal, religious, goofy, and prone to saying things outside of political orthodoxy. He was making too many pro-Soviet statements, in which the key Roosevelt advisor Edward Pauley later remembered in an oral history kept at the Truman Library of Independence. So his actions were such that I do not think that he would become, either by election or succession, a proper president of the United States, merely a president in waiting. So these are the major changes in the world. Roosevelt was laying the groundwork to continue the Big Three alliance after the war, but his death in April 1945 from a brain aneurysm changed things in a day. Castiglione says that Harry Truman, who had been vice president for only 3 months, had been kept in the dark about Roosevelt's plan and soon took a hard line against the Soviet Union. So Churchill lost the Labour Party, won parliamentary elections in Great Britain in July 1945, and Labour leaders had little sophistication in foreign affairs, and Truman, the buck stops here, also liked simplicity and unambiguous solutions, Castiglione says. In that year, saw dramatic changes as stated before. Roosevelt died, the war ended, Churchill was defeated, and the US dropped the atomic bomb on Japan twice, and Japan surrendered. So the 1940 election was Garner 2 times. In and out was Wallace, essentially being that Henry Wallace was the preeminent figure of the early 1940s, after only President Roosevelt himself. He was universally regarded as Roosevelt's heir to the New Deal of the Democratic Party. So he was vice president during most of World War II, so why would he not be vice president or chosen as vice president? Well, if you take into account how they wanted a president standing, then obviously he was not fit to be the job in the first place. It was Truman who was fit to be the job. Because in 1944, it was different. Wallace was out and Truman was in. This further corroborates how they wanted a different reason for selecting the vice president for the Democratic Party in the first place. By the spring of 1944, especially after D-Day, the powerful Anglo-American networks who had pulled together for the war effort realized that Hitler would be defeated, and that the key issue before them now was the shape of the post-war world. Having come into contact with FDR's anti-colonialist outlook, they were determined to destroy it. So they needed not just anyone to be the vice president, but someone who was actually going to go against FDR's policy, FDR's anti-colonialist outlook, and everything he did for his position. This is where you see the quick 180-degree turn on the actual attitudes during and after FDR's death. He didn't want the bomb drop. He didn't want colonialism. Whereas Truman, he wanted to recognize Israel. He wanted colonialism, and he wanted to drop the bomb. But he was merely chosen for those purposes. He wasn't chosen as an actual vice president. He was chosen as a president in stand-in. So now let's go into the actual background of how he was eventually chosen. This was the 1944 power struggle to get rid of Wallace. A grouping of key party bosses, none of whom been new dealers, knew Roosevelt was a dying man, but didn't have the power to get him to step aside as president. Yet they were going to do anything short of assassination to prevent Wallace from being in a position to become president and continue FDR's policy. The core group included Robert Hannigan, the new chairman of the Democratic Party, Edwin Pauley, Ed Flynn, Ed Kelly, Frank Walker, and Edwin Paul Watson. They lobbied the president day and night to get another vice president. Roosevelt, in his typical wily political way, had several other vice president contenders thinking they had his favor, but that Roosevelt's shrewd style. Robert Hannigan, who was formed from Missouri and was instrumental in getting Truman elected to the U.S. Senate, traveled 12,000 miles from January through June 1944, telling Democrats not to vote for Wallace. As you can see, their adamant stance on trying to vote against the Wallace to try and upkeep FDR's policy. So they were adamant in trying to get Truman in. So Dewey would be hard to beat by anyone else but FDR. As the 1944 convention neared, there was no real doubt about who the Democratic presidential nominee would be. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had faced serious opposition in 1940 when he broke the no third term tradition that began with George Washington. But in the midst of a global war, there was little appetite for ousting the commander-in-chief, so they wanted these things to stay in place. Besides, the Republicans had nominated 42-year-old New York Governor Thomas Dewey, who brought the campaign to his reputation as a liberal reformer and had picked popular Ohio Governor John Bricker as his running mate. The GOP ticket was formidable. FDR, the Democratic powers thought, was the only candidate who could stop them. So Truman, not wanting to take the position, was forced to actually do the president and standing chosen as the vice president. It was in the early summer of 1943, 1 year in advance of the Democratic National Convention, in which he had been invited to a Sunday lunch at the Washington home of Senator Joe Gruffy, as staunch New Dealer, who took him out into the garden to ask very confidentially what he thought of Vice President Henry Wallace. Truman had smiled and said Wallace was the best Secretary of Agriculture the country had ever had. Guffey, laughing, said that was what he thought too. Then he wanted to know if I would help out the ticket if it became necessary by accepting the nomination for vice president. And Truman recorded, "I told him in words of one syllable that I would not." So he didn't even want to be vice president in the first place, but he was chosen. So that is what the people knew. They did not know that FDR was dying. The public didn't know. But by 1944, Vice President Wallace was a hero to both organized labor and increasingly powerful African-American communities in America's biggest cities. But among the Democratic elite, opposition to him was even more fervent than it had been in 1940 because they needed this dire situation to pan out in his favor, not in Wallace's favor. Wallace's full-throated denunciation of segregation inflamed position throughout the South, angering a vital bloc of the Democratic coalition. So they needed someone who wasn't that adamant. They needed someone who was accepting of these things, someone who was willing. Truman wasn't the first choice, though. James Barnes was. At one point, the clearest alternative to Wallace was James Barnes, who on the Supreme Court before being put by Roosevelt was to head and to making him, in Roosevelt's own words, assistant president. But to his surprise with Barnes, in his role as assistant president, he'd angered labor with which was a Catholic who changed his faith when he married an Episcopalian, in which his conversion with Catholicism would actually offend white ethnics in cities. So his religious background would not help them catch the vote as presidency. So they needed another person. Again, Truman was the only one ending up as the only choice. Barnes was also a racist with a record, so his was not a clear choice that could make them win. Truman was a clear choice. His record was substantially clean and was not hidden at all of how he was going to do things. He was a congressman, senator, Supreme Court justice, Secretary of Office of Mobilization, Secretary of State, and Governor of South Carolina, but Barnes had this kind of nasty record with him. So the decision was made. Kingmakers met with FDR and convinced him that neither Wallace nor Barnes would be acceptable running mates. He signed off on their compromise choice, Truman. He was the only one who would have done the job and the only one who was chosen for it after all these decisions had panned out. The convention presented a slight problem, though. Roosevelt's preference almost didn't matter at all. Wallace had the support of a majority of delegates, as well as the overwhelming majority of Democrats around the nation. In 1944, a Gallup poll found that actually 65% of Democrats supported Wallace as FDR's running mate, while the relatively unknown Truman only earned support from just 2%. So we can now know that that was the high elites that wanted him in, and not just the public. So the time for vice president nomination came. On Thursday, July 20, the second night of the Democratic National Convention, a huge pro-Wallace demonstration erupted. Senator Claude Pepper of Florida, one of the most liberal members of Congress, tried to fight his way to the podium to put Wallace's name in nomination, a move that likely would have resulted in a stampede of votes. But the chair of the convention, Philadelphia Mayor David Lawrence, suddenly called for a voice vote to adjourn the day. Despite the clear overwhelming vocal majority of nays, Lawrence gavelled the convention to a close, with Senator Pepper just a few feet away from the microphone. And the end of the fix was in that Truman won. By the next day, the all-night efforts of Hannigan Chicago Mayor Kelly, the Bronx County Democratic boss Ed Flynn, and others had paid off. Although Wallace led on the first ballot with only 429.5 votes, of which Truman had 319.5, he was significantly short of a majority. By the second ballot, the rush to Truman was on. That November, the Roosevelt-Truman ticket won 432 electoral votes. In April 1945, less than 3 months after he began this fourth term, FDR was dead of a stroke. Truman was now president. Barnes went on to become Truman's Secretary of State and then Governor of South Carolina, where he adamantly opposed school integration while trying to tamp down the violent responses of the Ku Klux Klan. So this is what Senator Harry S. Truman said in early 1944 on that matter. The vice president simply presides over the Senate and sits around hoping for a funeral. Now what this means is that they only have hope for the president to essentially have an unfaithful matter for him to become president and to step up. So on April 12, 1945, the Secret Service rushed to him to the White House, where Harry S. Truman, a former senator from Missouri, got the news at the Capitol, in which he was sworn in by Chief Justice Harlan Stone, in which he said, "I felt as though the moon and the stars and all the planets fell on me last night when I got the news." Now, Truman told the reporters the next day, "I will have the most terribly responsible job any man ever had." Now, earlier we established that he was kept things because FDR didn't want to share the Manhattan Project or much of his political plans to him in the first place. He kept these secret. So essentially, Truman was in the dark from the time he was elected. So he was chosen as presidential nominee in July 1944, replacing Henry Wallace until Roosevelt's death. The two met only 8 times and most often in the company of legislative leaders. I was handicapped by lack of knowledge of both foreign and domestic affairs, due principally to Mr. Roosevelt's inability to pass on responsibility. Truman wrote in his diary he told Jonathan Daniels, who worked as an aide to both of them, that Roosevelt never discussed anything important at his cabinet meetings. Cabinet members, if they had anything to discuss, tried to see him privately after the meetings, essentially corroborating the statement that Truman was not shared anything by his president, FDR. So clearly, in the end, what we are left with is that FDR's policies were completely overturned by Truman. Truman was put in as vice president as a patsy. FDR was a very sick person. And however, FDR's death on April 12, 1945 was far from natural causes. The method, motives, and cover will be used again less than 20 years later, the JFK assassination. More information will be said on our broadcast on the subject next month. Is there any questions you'd like to present?
Yeah, wow. These two were very interesting conspiracy theories. I have two questions, but not about these conspiracy theories. It's
Yes.
about the USA in World War II. First one is, as we know, Japan was lost and they didn't accept to resign. So many people were dying for nothing. Then the USA decided to use nuclear weapons. And what do you think about it? So, do you think it was right or it was necessary?
Well, personally, I thought that it was definitely necessary for them to end the war, because there's this argument that if they hadn't dropped the nuclear weapons, then a lot more people would have died in a longer time span. That's how I would have perceived the war at the time. I didn't think that because they didn't drop the bomb that it would just end if the Japanese would give up. Because at the time we showed no clear signs of how the Japanese was going to respond with giving up in the first place. So yes, I do think that the nuclear weapons were necessary to end our dispute with them in the first place.
All right. Well, the second question is, what do you think would happen if the USA wouldn't across the Atlantic and would never land to Europe? If German submarines wouldn't let them and destroy them forever?
We would essentially just be going with what we were doing earlier. The public would have wanted neutral, so if we weren't involved at all, that means we would have just stayed neutral the whole time. Because without all these very peculiar things happening, without the Americans planning the Pearl Harbor attack, and without FDR's policies on when they were actually entered into war, the public opinion would have went with neutrality. So we would be isolationists all the way through without being involved in those matters.
And what the things would happen in Europe without the USA?
Well, I believe that Europeans would have. Oh, sorry. Hold on. There. I believe that if the U.S. were to stay neutral, that eventually Europeans would have had dealt with Hitler all the way through, because even though it was kind of a stalemate, I believe that the Europeans had the upper hand slightly on the Germans. But on the matter of the Japanese attacks, they would have completely taken over those territories and would have had things dealt with, and that is where they wouldn't have completely taken over, but the U.S. would have been much more neutral to that matter. So yes, the Japan would have taken over those territories, and yes, Europe would have been winning against Adolf Hitler.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Tell me you're from the Philippines.
Oh, actually, I myself am from the Philippines. I'm actually not from the U.S. So I actually came here when I was a bit young. So I learned all these things from when I was growing up here. But I do still have some Filipino heritage. But all these things learning was very interesting, because I got to learn completely different things on how the world worked, and I got to learn how the U.S. had a part in actually forming the Philippines that I moved from when I was a little child. So it was actually very interesting for me to learn about all these things, essentially on how these conspiracies made those wars happen and how everything panned out. I just like learning these kinds of things because it makes me have a greater source of how I can look at everyone's actions, how I can look at my own actions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to our presentations. And I really like your presentations too, even though I was kind of a little late. Sorry.
No problem. We like your presentations too. As I said, these two are really, really interesting conspiracy theories. I never thought about them before, especially the murder thing.
Right.
We'd like to do one in a couple weeks if we could. over the last part of World War I with Turkey and the fall and the institution of the British rule in Istanbul, and then maybe go into the nation of Turkey, because in the West, a lot of people have no earthly idea, and then we would like to share a little bit about how the United States got into World War I, because there's a lot of Lanska has found a lot of information on that you may not necessarily know, that it was another little trick how they got us into that one.
Yes, I heard about it, and I don't think I personally will be able to join it in early March, but our team will be. So I think we'll join it.
Okay. I'll keep contact with your teacher then, and we'll talk to you later. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
So we